we are pleased to welcome Quey Percussion Duo here for our composition weekend. They'll be doing a reading of student pieces written by our Levine private composition students. So the way the format is going to work, we're going to take roughly 10 minutes per student. Oh, I didn't introduce your names. So this is
That's okay.
and Tim. Yeah. They will play the student pieces, and then we'll ask the student to come up to the front, and we're going to give a short critique, which might focus on writing specifically for the instruments, or just general compositional feedback. All right. So without further ado, first on the program, we have a piece Pando by Henry Bodenstein. Henry is a student of Quey Gilbo.
Incredibly hard. I tried my best, but we also went under tempo. So yeah, so it's even faster than that. So it's not, well, the tempo is impossible. I'd say actually impossible. If it was slower, it would be possible, but maybe then the aesthetic might not be what you're going for. If you want more of an energetic thing, what I would say in that, if this were a trio, it would be very easy. Like if the marimba part was 2 players, no problem at all. But 1 player with the counterpoint that's happening, I think that's one of the biggest things, and we'll see this in some of the other pieces, right? The marimba, it's one thing to read about how to write for it, but until you see it actually happening, it's hard to translate that knowledge. Because most composers, if you're at a piano doing it, it might not be such a big deal. 10 fingers, the keys are a much more limited range, That's one of the things. So I might say, there wasn't necessarily any part of it that wasn't possible other than a tempo part, but it would take probably memorizing it, because you can't really, for a marimbist, you can't see what you're doing, and you can't touch the keys, right?
Yeah.
At least on piano, you might not be able to see what you're doing, but you're touching the keys.
Yeah.
On marimba, you can't see or feel what you're doing, so a lot of us memorize the music so that you can focus on what's happening. So in order to play that, I would probably have to spend a bunch of time memorizing the whole piece. And then the counterpoint part of it, where you have hand in going contrary motion, mallets moving in contrary motion, that would make it pretty difficult. The textures are really interesting, how the texture varied throughout, and you had a solo moment in the vibes, and I think that was really cool. It does help that it was most of the piece was mostly natural keys, right? So that did help me.
Yeah.
If it was all over the place, that would be like 10,000 times more difficult.
Yeah.
But, you know, just full disclosure, I was kind of sometimes just swinging at notes. Okay. Which, as a composer, you probably don't want that, right? That's probably wasn't your goal. It was certainly a really cool challenge. What about the vibe considerations?
Yeah, I think with vibraphone, you know, there wasn't anything in here that's as drastic as what Gene was dealing with the marimba part. Some of the stuff, the one thing I thought was interesting, you notated for the pedal, and then you noted that it was down the whole time, right? So the pedal's just down.
Probably should have like added more breaks.
Yeah, right. Or you know, thinking about your phrasing and where you want the sound to cut off or not. Because what happens with vibraphone, you know, that little solo section I have in the middle where it's like all this sound just kind of washes together. So thinking about how you want that to come across. Not that you want this either, right? You want something in between. So putting ideas, or even giving us as percussionists, giving us phrase markings, which seems like, why would percussionists want phrase markings? But we're musicians too. So just putting some phrase markings in would tell me what you want, more so than pedal is down. Yeah?
I mean, I've never really written for these
No,
instruments.
it's understandable.
It's a great,
right?
it's a great start.
But yeah, for a first go round, for sure, it's great. And thinking about when you write a duo, this is for everybody in the room, thinking about how the two parts fit together, right? Because a duo piece is really both, you need both parts to have the piece, and thinking about what the level is for one versus the other, right? Like his part is almost impossible, and my part is not so bad, right? So do you want an almost impossible part with a not so bad part, right? Or is my part just whole notes, which it's not, but if my part was just whole notes and he's playing all that craziness, does that fit well together as somebody who's going to create a homogeneous duo piece, right? So, and again, there's nothing wrong with what you've done, but as things that you can think about as you develop, you're very young, congratulations. You have a lot of time to, you know, develop what you want to do with things. So it's cool that you took the challenge of, I'm going to write a marimba vibraphone thing that I don't know anything about. Right? You got to start somewhere. So, yeah.
Nice job.
Next on the program, we have Jewel Drum to Snow. Alexander studies composition with samples.
This sounds really great. It's very, very nice piece, and the writing is very, very idiomatic for the instrument. Easy to play, pretty easy to read. I think one thing you can do, sort of like Tim mentioned, is adding some more expressive elements. So showing us, composition is more like providing the directions on how to put something together. So if you omit important steps like dynamics or shape or anything that you like to, character, any of that, you leave maybe too much on the performer to interpret the way that they want to. Maybe that's part of the piece, and then everyone's going to interpret it in different ways, and that's part of what makes the music interesting. And there are other composers that notate every little tiny detail. So you have to decide when you're composing how much of your thumb do you want on the scale of the interpretation, right? And I think in here, there are certainly some things like the tempo indication, some retardando and odd tempo, all that was great. More dynamics. We don't really know where to start, and we just kind of, there are some in there, but we kind of just made some decisions even on the fly here. What about vibes?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the vibe writing was also very nice. It fits well on the instruments. It's very idiomatic, same thing that Gene was mentioning. But you have in here, even in the score, add expression and dynamic markings, right? So, that's part of, I'm sure there was a deadline, right? I had to turn it in on time. But so that, the good news is, I need to do more, and you have it in there, but same thing, some pedaling, options of where you want sound to end, where you want sound to begin, that kind of stuff would help as well.
Yeah, in terms of pedaling on vibes, there's many more techniques than most composers, especially beginning composers, know about. The pedals down or the pedals up. Okay, that's obvious, but there's half pedal, there's feather pedaling, there's mallet dampening, there's all sorts of things that affect the articulation, right? So the best way is to get with somebody that knows what that is and maybe get in a room and learn about all those things and how that affects the articulation. Because marimba, you play the note, it could be a whole note, it could be a quarter note, it all kind of looks or sounds the same because the sustain is the sustain, and unless you write something like dampen, which is certainly something that people do. There's a famous marimba quartet by Dan Levitan. This kind of thing, it has a cool effect when all four people are doing it. But otherwise, outside of something special like that, you play a note and it rings for as long as it rings, no matter how it looks on the page, right? There's also things, dead strokes. This is something that any keyboard instrument can do, right? And it's a cool textural idea, so if you're playing something, you can add some texture in there or affect the articulation. But on vibes, you've got, I don't know if you want to demonstrate some feather pedaling.
Yeah, so it's just keeping the pedal moving, right, so that it doesn't get, if it's just down, right, there's a little bit more articulation to what I'm playing, even though I'm playing the same notes. Gene mentioned mallet dampening, which I actually did at the end of your piece here. You have this chord at the end. Right, so I'm leaving the pedal down so that the C continues to ring, but if I don't dampen this D, so I'm using the other mallet to get the D out of the way so that we can hear the chord.
And the way that you notate that is just an X. So you have one note, say it's C, and then you have D, right? But you want the C to go away. So you put an X after the C, and that tells the player to mallet dampen. So you're not going to re-pedal, but you're going to stop the C with the head of the mallet, right? Obviously, your mallets need to be free. You can't be playing while you're trying to do that. I mean, you can, you just have to think about it a little more carefully. So the good news is, if you don't know about any of this, just write it in the score. Say, I want you to feather pedal throughout. Or performer can ad-lib pedal. That way the performer knows that you have the liberty to interpret the part and kind of curate the part the way that we need to play it. So more words is always better. More just text is always better to help it out. Yeah, cool. Nice job. This is a fun one. It's a cool instrumentation. It's very, very interesting to play. I don't know if we've ever played a bongos and marimba piece. Very, very cool. Do you play bongos? Okay. Cool. So the bongo part is very tricky because you're constantly playing. I mean, most of the pieces all 16th notes. But sticking, or we call it sticking, which hand plays what. But when you have the snaps in tones, right? And you know that, it sounds great, and you understand what the sounds are. But when you're playing them a bunch in a row, it's so difficult to play like the different techniques in the same hands. You might have to play this kind of thing, right? So I would say to prepare for the slaps, make sure that there's maybe a little bit of time before it, so that your hands are working out in a way that this hand is not playing two in a row, right? So if you think about which hand has to play what, that will help you decide if you can get away from playing two quick notes in a row with the same hand, because that was a lot of the issue. I did my best at playing exactly what you wrote, and that's why it looked I was like kind of like really redlining where I was going. I'd also say the slap is more reserved for big impact points, right? So you might want to play more tones and add a slap in when you want a bigger accent. Instead of, right? that's what made that part particularly difficult. But I really love that you wrote a part that actually was the right techniques and the right sounds. You know, a lot of people that write for bongos, they might just write just the two drums, but you took it a step further and really tried to get inside. That was really, really cool.
Yeah, I think for the marimba part, again, it's certainly possible. If I had more time, it would be better. But one of the things that gets really challenging with marimba is when your hands start to go this way, right? So when we get further apart, it's much more difficult, not only to play it, but also to be accurate with it, because we're trying to look here and see all of this, right? So as your hands get spread apart or work in contrary motion, that becomes more difficult. Whereas if we keep things, you know, within 2 octaves, it's much easier to play apart. Not that, again, nothing in here is impossible by any means. But one thing that I think is very important about marimba or percussion playing as a whole is a lot of us started in the rhythmic world, right, of playing patterns and rhythms. So if we have music that is pattern-based, it makes things a lot easier. So for example, there's a part in here somewhere where your left hand plays this. Right? It changes notes, but that's what my left hand is playing. But then there's one chord where you play this. So the pattern changes one time, and that makes it infinitely more difficult than just playing the same pattern over and over, right? So things like that.
And the same with bongos. Like, this is pretty through composed. There's not a lot of repetition necessarily, and this is a very pattern-based instrument, right? So it would definitely be much more idiomatic if you wrote a pattern and then you repeated it, and then when you wanted that pattern to change, you stuck more pattern-based. All of our instruments, like Tim mentioned, almost everything we play is pattern-based, and then the only exception is typically keyboards. But we have, you got to think about percussionists. We study hundreds of instruments, and so our ability on each particular instrument is a reflection of studying hundreds of instruments, right? So if you read piano, you could probably read much better than somebody reading a marimba part. That's typically our issue because we're practicing drum set instead, or something else, you know? So the other thing, marimba, you should always keep it 1 octave apart between any 2 voices, right? If you get further than that, the sticks won't go further. You could go a little further between the 2 middle notes, but like as Tim mentioned, as it gets further away, it's really difficult for note accuracy, even if you haven't memorized it and you know what it is. And I'd say in all the repertoire that I know for chamber and solo playing, there's only few pieces where you're playing outside that octave between voices situation. And that would probably help out the most. I think this, though, the marimba part is not, yeah, it's not so bad. It's pretty good. Yeah, it's a cool jam, though. Nice job.
Next on the program, we have Minuet in C minor by Christopher Stubbs, who also studies with me.
writing is pretty manageable. No real issues with any of the writing. For me, I think there's one note out of range. There's a high F sharp somewhere there. I played down an octave. And what else? I think there's 2 measures that require 4 mallets. So I didn't do that. I just played the top 2 voices. So I recommend, you could do it. You could start the whole piece with 4 mallets, and then for those 2 bars, you've got that. But if you eliminate that 1 chord tone, you can play the whole piece with 2 mallets, and it's much more manageable. Again, you could totally do it, but I would say if you're gonna do it, maybe add some more voices so that there's a reason you're holding 4 mallets the whole time.
Oh, okay.
I don't think it changed the piece too much to have that 1 chord tone because it's just triad based, and Tim had half of it covered anyhow. So I think it works pretty well with that. Those are measures 18 and 19, in case you're wondering, right? The pedaling is like we talked about pedaling before. You wrote in a bunch of stuff, but sometimes you just don't say when to pedal. So you're very clear, and then you just abandon it, and then you come back and you're very clear again. So just be consistent with the pedaling. But yeah, it was very. I like this one. It's fun to play. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just some similar threads of stuff we said about thinking about the level of what you're writing for. So the whole piece works totally fine, but in one measure you have a 5. And in one measure, you've got this dotted 30-second note thing, which works fine, but then the whole rest of the piece is 8th notes and 16th notes, right? So it's kind of what he was saying with the 4 mallets. If you want this kind of more rhythmically complex piece, which is great, go for it, right? Instead of, here's one moment where I have a 5.
Right.
And then also, for my part, it's totally fine for me, but there's one measure where there's a one-handed roll, right? Which is a more advanced marimba technique than I just started. So does the one-handed roll, being able to play that, fit with being able to play these different, diatonic scale passages, and thinking about those kinds of things? Yeah.
Was the last measure supposed to have a D in the bass or a C in the bass?
D.
You want to see it?
Because,
No, I'm just curious. I didn't know because we're all playing. It's all octave C's, and then he's playing a D that resolves to the E flat in C minor, which is cool. I just wanted to make sure we didn't play it wrong and it wasn't printed wrong. But yeah, I think it's cool. I think it's great. Do you have any questions?
no, thank you.
Yeah, great, nice, good job.
Okay, we'll be switching over to the adult part of the program. So many of our adult students study with Jordan Chase, so I'll let him introduce them.
Hi everyone, I'm Jordan Chase. I also teach composition here at Levine. We're moving to the Jordan Chase composition students section of the program. At least the next 4. So the first piece you're going to hear is called Etude by Rachel Glick. And as you might have read in the program notes, this is actually Rachel's first piece ever. So pretty cool to have your first piece read by a professional duo. I know I didn't have that experience. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy it.
piano, very like yeah, the Chopin E minor prelude or something. It is an E minor anyway. So cool, very cool. I mean, the only thing for me would be the pedaling stuff because I just did my own thing. This would be a great one for mallet dampening. So as we were talking about before, obviously if the pedal's down. It has an appeal, right? If you want that more legato and sort of pitches ringing over each other, I can see it working well that way, right? If you mallet dampen, right? And again, that would just be writing an X right after that note, so that you know if you pedal everything, there's so much space in between that it doesn't sound connected, right? And that's probably the best example of those three options and how it could really affect the articulation or the phrasing. The other way is if you draw a bunch of slurs in any verb music, even if it's snare drum or bongos or something, if you show us the phrase like a wind player would play, whether they would tongue or play legato, right? Dee-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da-dum, or it's dee, right? Or da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. If you show us, we'll figure out what technique goes with that, you know? So just, that's what I would say with this. This one seems like throughout just mallet dampening would, like I did, probably make the most sense to connect that line.
Yeah, the only thing for me, it's all very well written. The only thing is at the end when you start to add these rolls. If you wanted it the way that I played it, or if you wanted the roll to actually start on one because they're tied together,
Yeah.
right? So then you would want to make sure that you put the tremolo notation on the first note and tie it over to the second note.
Well, let's do something. Can you do it 45? Because we have a couple minutes, right? Okay. If we do it 45, let's play it as written, just 4 bars, right?
Sure.
But what if you did a roll the whole time, but still did the shape? Or what if you rolled all the notes, even the single note? There's just sort of different effects that sounds much more
Yeah.
linear, you know. The roll, it's hard to not make a roll sound rhythmic or like jittery, you know. So that's part of it too. So anytime you write a roll, it really is going to stand out, especially to a non-percussionist as a rhythm. You know, it's like why are they just playing this fast rhythm all of a sudden? You know, so yeah, cool, nice job. Sounds good.
Next on the program, we have Bouncing the Ball by Steve Messner.
definitely parts of it were like really cool, and then other parts of it was more like that first piece where it was, I wish I had another player with me, you know, kind of thing. And as we mentioned earlier, I think some of it, the voices, these two voices and these two voices being too far away, that sometimes you can't see the notes and you're just kind of swinging for the notes. The other thing I might say, yeah, just like at the counterpoint, if it's moving with such varied intervals, like, and it's not just, not scalar. If it's two scalar lines, it's much easier than if both lines are kind of jumping around. There's nothing impossible here. It would just be, like a month of practice and memorizing kind of situation. So there's nothing wrong and nothing impossible. It would just take, you know, and it's not the whole piece. It's just like, okay, these 8 bars, and then these 8 bars, you know, that kind of thing. I really liked how, you know, the key changes made an impact on the harmony. Well, obviously that's what they do. But it was a nice direction in the piece, and then the theme that you brought back later in F minor when it was in, you know, C earlier, it's very cool. What do you have about the vibes?
Yeah, I think the vibe part works well, works fine. One thing that we have to think about, especially when we're playing 4 mallets and you write chords, is what position that puts us in. Because now sometimes we've been spending all day saying, don't write when the intervals are too far apart. And now, don't write when the intervals are real close together.
Just don't write anything.
Right? So, you know, for me, like when you're playing some of this stuff, the chords can be really difficult from a physical standpoint. Again, not that it's impossible, but your voicing can really help, you know, put same notes, just put it in a different spot so that we can get more spread out and more
So for example, like B flat major in a closed position, we're like this. To go to B major, I have to do this. Okay? It's the exact opposite. So this is a good exercise for all the students to go from B flat to B, right? But if you went yada-yada-yada, like that won't happen, right? So that's what Tim's saying. So if your B major was voiced, or your B flat major was voiced like this, it's much easier. All of a sudden you don't do this, you just do this. Or if you leave one note out, you see what I'm saying? So that's a little bit inside baseball because you have to know a little bit about how it works. But that's sort of the issue where that's one of the ways that's so different from piano because you have a couple different places you can play the key. You can play the D here, but you can also play it a little closer to the accidentals if you need to, right, as well. So for us, we have to kind of play in the center of the bar all the time, so it's tricky. I'd say there are a couple of moments where you have fast one-hand passages like this lick in E flat major. Like that's just going to be challenging for someone to keep in one hand. So you might want to simplify or something like that, not all 16th notes, because just technically, you know, some people could do it, but it's going to be one of those, you know, the accuracy is 50-50 on that. And with a piece like this that's pretty tonal, you probably don't want to chance accuracy, you know. I think that's one kind of thing, like as composers, we've read a lot of pieces too. Sometimes we make decisions based on, well, we want to make sure that it's accurate, so we're going to dial it back a little bit, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, thanks so much.
Next on the program, we have Symbol Domains by Claire Rosser. Those of you who knows Claire's work, this is probably her most experimental in the last several years. So something different for Claire.
not weird at
Have
all.
you all ever done it down there?
No.
No.
I mean, it's like sort of percussion kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, but it's totally in that vein. Like the harmony is pretty constant. It doesn't go too many places where you can just kind of sit and listen to frequencies and things happen. There's nothing in the vibe part that other than pedaling, but I would assume you wanted it all kind of just to ring,
Yeah.
Although I don't know, if you didn't, just definitely make sure, some of this moving stuff, if you wanted it,
No, I
you
like
wanted it
it.
all just to ring, yeah.
Yeah.
So you could right at the beginning, pedal down throughout, and then you don't have to worry about it. But I assume because of the text and the sound bath thing that I kind of knew what to do anyway.
That's great.
But most of the symbol thing is certainly a point of
Yeah.
discussion.
Right, I think just having an idea of, we took some liberties. I don't know if you like it or not, but having an idea of, or more information like we were talking about earlier, of how you want that, because a lot of these repeated notes on a suspended cymbal, like it starts to get lost, which is why we went to this, but.
What's that? Oh, just a different.
Yeah, it's just a stick, but even having something that's harder but not a stick, right? There's more of that wash but less articulation if you wanted some kind of, brush sound. But yeah, so all kinds of variabilities as to what sticks we use when we play something, and even what kind of cymbal we use. Right, so we brought this just for, experimentation purposes, right? But what if it's on this cymbal? Right, it's a totally different sound than.
Yeah, I'm glad you went with the
Good, okay, but.
We want to calm down.
So.
And with those things, if you don't know, some composers that know the lingo, they'll say, I need a 17-inch Zildjian, medium crash, whatever. But most people don't know that, and actually it's kind of confusing, because if you're a performer and you don't have that symbol, then what do, right? If you just say very large cymbal, or a really bright cymbal, or a really dark sounding cymbal, use terminology that's more universal. So in weights of cymbals, you have thick, medium, and thin. So the thinner the cymbal is going to be sort of a brighter, splashy sound. A thick cymbal is going to be very dark and kind of clangy. And then the sizes, if you just say small, medium, or large, it's just going to be more robust the larger you get, obviously. And for this, I would say, you might say, I want a large, dark sound, rather than a small, bright sound, which would be like, psst. Like a little, telling a joke, a little rim shot or something. You don't want that for this, right? And so if it doesn't say in the score, we made our best guess, but you might get way too many interpretive ideas of what your piece wants
No,
to be.
I think you did a great job, and thanks. I wanted to thank you and thank the school for bringing this, because
Oh, yeah.
Jordan's my teacher, and he can attest to the fact that, well, this was the first I've ever done anything for percussion, but it has affected my usual work. So ever since I did a couple of using the other instruments, but then I chose this one for this event because it's so different.
Yeah, sure.
But I learned from this exercise. So the music I generally write now has a little more, I think, rhythmic variety, right,
Yeah.
Jordan? And it just happened because of you guys coming, and thank you very much.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks. Nice job.
On the program, we have Soft Touch by my student, David Rye.
you're staying within the same chord, but changing the inversion all over the place. So my intervals are changing all over the place. Whereas, you know, perhaps, I don't know, not to say that nothing in here is impossible, but if you write, right, like that's so much easier than, right, all of these chords happening with all four voices all the time with changing of intervals. So a lot of times if you just simplify that same idea, the piece it's much easier to put the piece together instead of struggling as I did.
Yeah, I'd say another thing about just four mallets, when you hold the sticks, you naturally play a fourth or a fifth. That's where it feels like you're not doing anything, you're not manipulating the mallets. So I'm not saying just write music with fourths and fifths, but that's just so you know where it's really comfortable, okay? And then thirds and sixths, just a little bit closer or wider than that. Octaves are really tough, and seconds are really tough. So the further you get away from fourths and fifths, the more difficult it becomes, right? It's still all totally manageable, but if you're jumping octave, third, sixth, this and that, it's much, much more difficult to do that if you're changing intervals a lot. Especially if you're just staying in one triad, just a C major triad, and you're always just changing inversions of that chord, you're actually changing intervals, but you're still getting the same chord. So is it worth asking the player to go through all of that when the chord's not changing, you know? Like Tim was talking about, that's why, back earlier to like the more pattern-based music, if we were to play, we play much more complicated sounding stuff that's way easier than I think half of these pieces. So if you come to the concert later, it'll look like we're playing fireworks on marimba, but it's literally easier than half the stuff we are reading today. And it's just because the people that wrote it are percussionists and they kind of just know, right? So the only way to really get to that level where you're using it as efficient as possible is just try to connect with a percussionist. That would really, really help. And there's probably a lot of information on YouTube and stuff. Even if you watch marimba tutorials, like how to play marimba, you'll get a quick sense of how to use the intervals, you know? So if you're locking into a groove, these mounts aren't great for that. It's just all fifths, right? So it sounds like there's a lot of stuff happening, but it's like literally an exercise for us, right? So just using the technique to its advantage. Even if this was locked into a third up here, it's like an exercise. And you might not want to write something like that, but that's just showing you a little bit how our intervals work. And most of the time in our music, we're not changing intervals so dramatically. Maybe in a hairy lick or two, but not like the whole piece. And I don't know if your part was similar to that, but
Yeah, right. So like, you know, at the end of my little solo at the beginning, where you have this going on. Right? While this is still doing all of this stuff. Again, not that it's impossible, but it's something that Gene always, you know, will bring up. Is like, is the juice worth the squeeze? You know, like if I'm learning this piece that has this nice, you know, soft touch to it.
I see what you did there.
You know, does that match up with all of the effort that I have to put in to make the piece happen?
Yeah, and it's sort of like, this is very tonal. You don't want to like step in the hole and play a wrong note. So it's even more like walking the tightrope when the technique is really hard and you can't really color outside the lines, you know. And like a contemporary abstract piece, if you play a B flat instead of an A flat, it's not going to be nearly as detrimental as in your piece, which is very much we all hear when we play wrong notes. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Nice job.
Before our final piece on the program, I wanted to plug a couple of things. Our head marketing has asked me to take some photos of our students afterward. So if all of our students can stay after the workshop today so we can take some photos in front of the instruments. It'll look really cool. All right, and then at 3 p.m., please come back here for the performance, and you'll get to hear all that cool stuff. All right, so last on the program, we have Path by the Water by William Collins, who is a student of Abner Finberg.
See the steam coming out of your head, Tim.
Yes, you can.
It's like playing Guitar Hero on like the highest level. Nice. The vibe part, I was totally cool. I just wish I could help Tim some of the time.
Yeah, so, you know, again, some of the similar things that we've been discussing throughout the day, but as the hands start to split between like all like the back and forth, like half and half thing, and if you just condense it down to the same octave, you know, get rid of the split nature of it. Let me see if I can find the spot. Yeah, so like this whole thing. If it's just all here, you know, it's so much easier than trying to be spread across the instrument with the same notes. And then, I certainly didn't take the time to figure out, but when you have these runs that are coming down and changing the chord as it goes, I mean, it works fine. It's just tricky when the notes then become, and then go back the other way, right? So the note finishes, and then we have a big jump back up to that spot. So it's just idiomatic aspects of writing for the instrument, which is hard to do if you don't play the instrument.
With like runs down an instrument that restart, you have to know that we're going to have to play the last couple of notes in one hand so that the other hand can start. So if we're up here, we're going down like this. To get back to the top, this hand has to play the last couple for this hand to come back up. So that's what we talk about in stickings. And the more you have to play in one hand, the more difficult it becomes, like accuracy issue will come into play. So if it's all a scale, it's not so bad, but if it's leaps with one hand, it's gonna be a real question mark. For even the best of us, I think. Certainly, I would say there are people that just specialize in marimba only, like they are a marimbist, like that's all they've ever learned, that's all they ever do, and they could play piano transcriptions and they can figure out how to do it. But I would say most percussionists aren't that. They're more generalized, and a lot of people that come from a drumming background, they might not even read a single melody too well, right? So if you write for middle school or high school, it might be, we're just talking about one monophonic single line might be where it's at depending on where, you know? I think the level that most of this stuff is at least college level, all this little permutative type things. The other thing you could do is that sometimes you say, well, don't write this really disjunct thing, but it could totally work if it becomes more pattern-based, like you stay on it for a little while. Then the performer can figure out that technique and how to stick it, and then they can move to something else. So I don't want, it seems like we keep saying just write pattern music, but it does help if you use the technique and start from a more pattern-based thing. When that starts moving around and you go from one pattern and the next beat is another pattern, the next beat's another pattern, that's where the cumulative aspect of playing through it becomes difficult. That's what I, you know.
Yeah, and so much of what we do naturally is physical, right? For playing percussion, there's a visual, physical aspect to what it is. And so that repetitive motion actually helps us to play something more accurately versus having, you know, patterns that aren't the same throughout. Yeah, right? Like it's like shooting free throws. You shoot the free throw, like, okay, I got a free throw, but then if you move the line like a foot closer, now I'm missing every shot. You know, it's that kind of...
I miss every shot all the time. I think the vibe melody was very beautiful. It was really nice, and I think a mallet dampening on this between note to note would be really nice because you probably want it clear without it being disjunct. It was cool. It was very idiomatic for the vibe. Yeah. Great job. Yeah.
For everybody in the room, thank you for taking this on and exploring something that was probably very different for most of you. And hopefully you got a lot out of it. Part of what we do as a duo is commission works and work with composers. So it's very important to us that Percussion Duo, you know, is a thing that continues to develop and thrive. So thank you for your time that you put into working on this.
The other thing I'll say is we're playing 6 pieces at the concert. They're all going to be very different. That's what we do. We don't ever program. We will never do a vibe and marimba concert. Like we'll play something very different every piece. So I will say that if you go to the concert and you're interested in, hey, what does that score look like? How is it notated? Like, well, I'll just send you the scores if there's something you're interested in. As long as you don't share them or whatever, because the composers might be mad at us. But that's one of the best ways. Just study scores, find pieces that you like, and try to go to a library and get a hold of the score.
All right, let's give a special thank you.